Good afternoon and welcome. Thank you for joining us today. Today is Monday, August 14th, 2023, and we are here in the conference room in the Commissioner's office at our Administrative Services Building in Fort Collins for a work session with our Community Planning, Infrastructure, and Resources Department. I am Larimer County Commissioner Jody Shag McNally, Chair of the Board of County Commissioners. Joining me at the table today are my colleagues, Larimer County Commissioner John Gonzalez and Larimer County Commissioner Kristen Stevens. Also at our conference table is our County Manager, Lauren DeVolker, and our Community Planning and Infrastructure Resources Director, Lesli Ellis. I won't introduce the rest of the folks in the room because I'll let you do that. I know their names, but I'll let you do that as we go along. And I appreciate everyone being here today. We have some really interesting things on the agenda today. So Lesli Ellis, I will let you take over. Thank you.
All right. Good afternoon, Commissioners. Lesli Ellis, Community Planning, Infrastructure, and Resources Director. And in customary fashion, I'll hand it off fairly quickly to our, on the first item, to Eric Freed, who is going to present to you on the tiny house rules and what we're doing here locally in Larimer County to address tiny homes in our county, both through the building code and perhaps through our land use code also. And so, Eric, then if you have others who you'd like to bring up to the table as part of your presentation, please invite them and introduce them as well. But I'll just turn it over to you. Thank you so much.
So tiny homes is a subject we've been discussing for several years, and I know all the commissioners have a great interest in that because they've all approached me one time or another. And we've been discussing in community development for almost 10 years since we started getting inquiries about tiny homes, tiny houses, and how can people live in them. But the current effort basically goes back to 2021 when the commissioners, in particular Commissioner Shattuck McNally, asked us to look at state rules and what the problems were for why someone couldn't live in a tiny house for more than 30 days at a time or 180 days at a time, depending on their situation. So we looked at, we drafted a memo, ran it through Colorado Counties, Inc. Eventually, State Representative Kipp agreed to be the prime sponsor of a bill. We spent a lot of time working on the bill. It's not perfect, no bill ever is. There are compromises and there are things looking back you realize, oh, maybe we should have done something different. But the bill passed in 2022 and required the State Housing Board to adopt a standard for long-term occupancy of tiny homes and rules by this past July 1st. And so they began talking about those rules. They finalized the rules this spring. The Colorado Housing Board adopted the rules on May 9th with an effective date of June 30th. The first day they were willing to accept applications for tiny house manufacturers, installers, sellers, all that. Was after that, but because it was July 1st was a Saturday, and then it was July 4th holiday. Anyway, the rules first went into effect July 3rd. So then we have to figure out what our policy is going to be to deal with, and I'll talk about what the rules are and why we still need a policy. I drafted a policy on how we want to handle tiny homes, brought it to the Board of Appeals for their feedback and discussion on August 9th, which I can report to you, and then that brings us here to Board of County Commissioners to see what you think of the rules. So now that we have a state program for what could be a legal tiny house to be used as a home, why do we need a county policy? Because first of all, the program was just stood up on July 1st, so any tiny home built before then could not go through the program because the program didn't exist. So there's maybe, it's anyone's guess, there might be 100 in Larimer County or so. There might be a few thousand in the state that were not in the state program because the state program didn't exist. Even now, manufacturers can sign up to be listed by the state and be inspected and get approval. But I've talked to most of the tiny home builders in the state, not the individual ones, but most builders are building 5 or 6 or 8 tiny homes a year. These are not huge factories. And so I've talked to most, and so I know through my work who most of the tiny home builders are. There's one in Fort Collins, there's one in Colorado Springs, there's one in Durango, there's some here and there, Lyons. Most of the ones I've talked to are either definitely not going through the state program or not sure they're going to go through the state program because they find that the rules that were adopted are either too strict or the costs are too high. The bill that was passed did say that when the state adopted rules, they were supposed to keep in mind that most tiny home manufacturers are small operations, the importance of affordability and things like that. But whether they did or not, I guess time will tell. And just to be clear, I've talked to Division of Housing officials. What do they want to do with tiny homes that don't fall through this program, like the existing tiny homes, or what they call legacy tiny homes? And they've said they're leaving that up to locals. That's our call, what to do with the ones that didn't go through the program. As well as it's very clear in the rules and state law that footings and foundations, that's up to the local administration when there is one. There are parts of the state where there's no building department. But we would be the ones to define what's a footing and foundation, the utility connections, any on-site additions. If they did do a basement, and I've heard there's one tiny house manufacturer that's looking at basements for tiny houses, which seems kind of contradictory. You're making the house as small as you can, then you put a basement under it. But people are very creative and do all kinds of things. So that's why I think we still need a county policy. So what's in the state rules? I sent you as part of your packet the full 60 pages of state rules, and I'm sure you all read those and made annotated notes. I'm thinking Commissioner Shadegg probably read them all, but there's a lot in there. So basically, to try to walk through it quickly, they put in a certain number, and these rules are not just for tiny homes. It was an update to the state rules on all manufactured homes, so HUD homes, modular homes. They added the word tiny home in a lot of places, and there's a couple things specific to tiny homes. So there are definitions now for a built-for-purpose trailer. So basically, it's a trailer designed for tiny home to move and sustain a tiny home. It gets a VIN number and stuff so you can move it on the highways. So you can't put a tiny home on any trailer you find that won't hold the weight. They define permanent foundation, temporary foundation. They try to clarify what the difference is between a tiny house and a tiny home. So there's already something in the building code called a tiny house. You either manufacture it on site, it's just very small, no more than 400 square feet. You get all your inspections as you go along. It's like any other house, just tiny. There was also something in state law where you could build a modular home that complies with the adopted state code, which is the 2018 residential code. And in that code, there's a definition of tiny house. So if the tiny house was built to the modular standard under the state rules already, that was a tiny house. The whole point of this is we realized there was a whole bunch of product out there, tiny homes that were not built to the IRC necessarily, that were not built on site, that were on wheels, and how do we handle those if they want to live in them long term? So that's how we define tiny home, to be that sort of niche. Anyway, the state was also supposed to adopt a standard for tiny homes by July 1st, but there really is not a freestanding standard for tiny homes. At this point, there are now one and probably two efforts to have a national standard developed, one through ASTM, which is the standards organization, and then another one through ANSI. So there's two going on at the same time, from none to two. We don't know when those will come out, but they may come out with something that's more appropriate as this fits tiny homes better. If they do that, the State Division of Housing will have a chance to update their rules. Not clear if they can only do that once a year or it's a big process. But, you know, these are the temporary rules we have in place because there wasn't any standard. So instead, the State Technical Advisory Committee adopted the IRC, which state is on the 2018 IRC. We're on the 2021. And they adopted the tiny home appendix from the later code since it was better, made a few tweaks to it, put it into state law. So the state certified tiny home will basically be built to the International Residential Code, not that much different than a regular home for now. Page 19 and 20 of the rules were manufactured and tiny home installation standards. Our local rules can be more stringent but not less stringent than the state. That's typical for the electrical and plumbing code and whatever wildfire codes coming down the line. But we can adopt unique local geographic and climatic conditions, like what is our snow load, our wind load, what's our wildfire hazard requirement, and the state will uphold those. Manufacturer has to provide written installation instructions for a tiny home, whether it's going to go on a temporary or permanent foundation or just be an RV. And if there are no installation standards, for it to get a building permit and be long-term, you have to have a foundation and structural attachment requirements by a licensed Colorado professional engineer. So then these are the fees, some of the fees in the state policy. This is one of the things I heard from tiny home manufacturers was a deterrent to them. To register the plant itself is $600. An inspection agency is $250, a seller $250, installer $250. If a small manufacturer might be all of those things. They might be a plant, they might have to hire an inspection agency, they might sell and install. That's $1,100 right there. There's a plan review fee of $160 minimum. To get an insignia, that's $125. An installation insignia of $60. Plant's got to be inspected. When you start adding these things up, it's thousands of extra dollars to. And this works better for a bigger manufacturer. If you think about it, a plant manufacturer is $600 to register with the state, whether they're producing 2 tiny homes a year or 200 modular homes. So it hits harder on the small manufacturers. So that's one issue the tiny home manufacturers have said to me, is that they think the fees are too high. And then the rules, every tiny home that comes out, as well as other manufactured homes, has to have a state certification insignia on it. If you want to be a registered manufacturer, you have to have a quality control program approved by the state, and your quality control people approved by the state. If you're also selling direct to purchasers, you have to register as a seller as well. The next one is probably the one I've heard the biggest complaint about, especially from Mitchcraft, the local one. And I understand why. In order to protect consumers, there have been cases where consumers paid for their tiny home and got nothing because it was a not just reputable manufacturer. So in order to protect consumers, the state says, okay, you have to provide a letter of credit or surety for a $100,000 bond in case you don't deliver the unit. I believe that's for each unit you're doing. So for a small manufacturer to take the money and actually put it into the labor and materials and build a tiny home and put $100,000 aside, that's difficult. They don't really have that. So then before you begin building the home, you have to have the state approve the design. If the state's not inspecting it directly, then your third-party plan reviewers and inspectors must be approved. And the state, like in most things, in my opinion, is underfunded and understaffed. So they use a lot of third-party agencies to do these things because they just don't have enough state staff to do it. Tiny home plans have to include the chassis it's on, the connections, and whether it will have a temporary or permanent foundation. The state will not review that, but they want to know which one. Then the structure has to come to the site with an insignia of approval, which, because most of the colors were taken, wound up being pink or magenta. But perhaps that's great in this year of the Barbie movie craze. So, sellers also have to register with the state and put up $50,000 credit. So I guess if you're the manufacturer and the seller, that's $150,000 you have to set aside. Installers have to be registered and certified by the state, as well as do inspectors if they're third-party inspectors. They need training, experience, continuing education. So it's a pretty strict set of rules. I mean, basically the rules are pretty much the same for modular homes and HUD homes, but we try to fit tiny homes into the existing state program rather than recreate the wheel. And it may be too strict for tiny homes, I'm not sure. But anyway, those are the rules to protect consumers and all that. So therefore, because the rules are strict and because we think not everyone will go through it, and also because there are already a bunch of tiny homes that are out there that are not eligible for state certification, we're thinking we need a county policy of how we're going to deal with all those tiny homes that don't fit in the program now that we have it. And the idea is we want to make sure that tiny homes are safe. Obviously, that's the whole point. You know, if we don't know how they were built or who inspected them, we want to make sure they're structurally sound, that the electrical wiring is safe, that the plumbing is good, that the gas venting is good, all that kind of stuff. Now, we had an existing policy, which when I was doing research, I found, for converting a park model RV to a permanent house. And for the park model RV, you can have an RV that you tow behind your car. It can be a little teardrop. It can be a Silver Stream, I think. But a park model RV is like a little cabin. In fact, our Natural Resources Department has park model RVs at Horsetooth and at Carter Lake, I think, that they rent out as cabins. So they're bigger and they look more like a cabin. And they're built to a different standard. So we're thinking the basic rules would be if you want to get a building permit and live in your tiny home permanently, first of all, you'd have to comply with all the land use code rules for a dwelling unit. Those rules can be updated, and I think our planning folks are looking at the rules and should have more options for tiny home communities or cluster developments or something like that. Luckily, our land use code does not have any minimum size for a dwelling unit, like some counties or cities do. It's very easy to outlaw tiny homes without outlawing them per se. You just say that every home has to be at least 420 square feet, for instance. And since a tiny home is no more than 400, you've just outlawed tiny homes. We don't have a minimum for a house. We don't even have a minimum for an accessory dwelling unit. We have a maximum for an accessory dwelling unit. So for now, every place that a dwelling unit's allowed, whether as a primary home or if it wants to be an accessory dwelling unit, then there are provisions to go through and get approval as an accessory dwelling unit or an extended family dwelling or farmstead help. We would just treat those as a dwelling unit as long as they're approved by county building. Okay, so the second one would be either it's a park model RV with the label on it, or if we can verify that it complies with IRC Appendix Q, so they're, it's relatively safe as a dwelling unit. Then we need a licensed Colorado professional engineer to review and approve it, that it meets the wind, snow, and structural loads, or tell us what to do to make it do that. Make sure there's emergency escape and rescue openings at bedrooms, sleeping lofts, because a lot of these tiny homes have a kind of a creative staircase to a sleeping loft, that the code allows more flexibility there. Then we'd have to have an approved permanent foundation, either one of the types out of the IRC or an engineered design that we accept, or we're still working on our policy for what can be a permanent foundation and trying to get a little more creative for tiny homes because they're so much smaller. Colorado licensed master electrician review and approve the wiring, licensed master plumber. Septic system is up to the Larimer County Department of Health and Environment, and we've been talking to them as well. Maybe there are standards that make more sense for a tiny home, because all these homes are going to have, at worst, bathroom, toilet, sink, shower, kitchen sink, and dishwasher, and that's all. And you think about some of the big homes we build, and they may have 6 bathrooms and 2 kitchens and all kinds of plumbing, so maybe they don't need as big a septic system. They'd have to comply with wildfire hazard area rules, either our county wildfire hazard area rules or the somewhat stricter ones now in the wildfire hazard area we define for Loveland Fire. And if it could do all those things, then we could initiate a building permit, take it in, review the plans, verify they work, issue a permit, do our inspections, and issue some kind of certificate of compliance. We probably wouldn't call it a certificate of occupancy, only because if it's prefab and we haven't seen it all the way through, we don't know for sure how it's built. But it's similar to what we do with as-builts under code compliance. If someone built a home or a basement finish, we issue a certificate of observable compliance. I don't know what the exact wording we're going to want to use is. But that's the basic idea. And I'll be done soon, and then we can just discuss what you think. So a little bit more on permanent foundations. There is a definition in state law and further clarified in the rules. The basic idea is it would transmit all loads into the ground, both the gravity loads and the wind or shear loads, resist lateral movement and overturning, provide frost protection, and is intended to stay permanently attached to the ground and to the trailer. It's not intended to be taken away. So, anything found already in the residential code, which is your typical footing and stem wall, the little inverted T, or piers perhaps, or maybe a slab, or I've seen slab strips under where the bearing points are. The bearing on these things is just typically on the outside. And then we're looking at other things that might work, like something called diamond pier, which is that one on the left. It's a metal sort of box, I guess you could say. You drive rebar through it down into the ground to keep it in place, and then you can attach the tiny home to the diamond pier. Something similar called ground screws, or they're sort of like helical piers that you could just drive into the ground. So the thing is, if we're looking at affordable, and then the last one is an XI2 that I use for modular homes. It's like a cross bracing that goes into the ground and provides resistance to shear forces. The idea, though, basically is that we don't want to have a tiny home, which they're trying to save money on, and make them dig down a 30-inch deep foundation and do all the excavation and add $40,000 to the cost. So we're trying to look at things that make more sense, but we'll still hold it in place. And we're not quite done with that, but so what happens next? This is a policy, so we don't need to adopt any new codes. But I wanted to bring the policy to you, see if you think we're on the right track or what your direction is. We have to do a little bit more research and determine what's an approved foundation type. Health Department's doing some work on their rules to see if they might want to change any of their rules to accommodate tiny homes. I think once we figure out what our building division policy will be, the planning division just needs to tweak the land use code, because I think right now it says a state certified tiny home, and that's the ideal. But we realize there are some that are not going to fall under the state certification program, and then we would just let people know that we've adopted a policy. Here's how we're going to do it. Inform customers and start accepting applications for as-built tiny homes. Long term, I think the planning division and Planning Commission and the Board of Commissioners can see if there's any desirable changes we want to the land use code to make it, more encouraging or accepting of tiny homes. So that's my presentation today, and then I would just like to have a discussion and see what you all think about this.
Thank you, Eric. Appreciate all that. I don't know, did we get these slides? Because I don't think that
No.
was, okay,
I
so it'd be
just got
great
those
to
done
have
today. I'll
those.
send them
Okay,
to
I
you.
didn't see them, so.
Yeah.
I think that was a really great synopsis. I know a lot of these conversations were when we did the stakeholder process for the House bill that passed and became the tiny home law. I don't even remember what that was, 1285 or 12?
HB 22-1242.
Yeah, that's right, 1242. About affordability and some of these other things. So I have a couple of questions. I know these were all discussed, so I know it's not something that kind of came out of nowhere, some of the concerns about cost and stuff. I'll see if my colleagues have some questions. I have a couple about safety. So Commissioner Stevens, do you have a question?
Thank you, Eric. I will fully admit I did not read all 70 pages. We also had a 800-page land use document at the same time, so, but it wasn't because, I don't care about the topic. So I appreciate the sort of executive summary. So with the state standards, while the state has a program, small manufacturers don't necessarily need to comply with that program if they don't want to?
No, they're supposed to.
Okay.
They're required to. I'm just saying that I don't know that most of the small manufacturers in the state are going to. They're going to keep making tiny houses, either for sale out of state or for RVs, or run the risk of being out of compliance with state law.
Okay. That's, so we don't, it looks like it's maybe cost prohibitive for them, and so they're gonna look at a different model for how to still stay in business without complying, and that's not what we're dealing with here. So, when we're talking about new policies, at some point, will we only accept these sort of things that are state certified, or will we continue to have sort of these non-compliant or people who got in before there was a state policy kind of situation, so the as-built kind of thing? Will we at some point say, okay, no, now you really need to comply with those policies, and or will we know if, when they were built? And
Right.
I'm a little confused on how we sort of operate within the state standards and still kind of have this as-built kind of category.
Yeah, that's the $64,000 question. Ones that were built before the policy went into effect, clearly we have to have some alternative way. So then we have an option for the ones that, let's say, are being built now that don't go through the state. We can just say, well, you have a legal path to follow. You didn't follow it, so you can't have approval as a building. You can't get a permit. Or we could be somewhat more lenient and try to work with people because, so let's say you buy a tiny home, put it on your property. You're just a homeowner. You didn't know you were supposed to follow these rules. You didn't buy it from an approved deal or whatever. Are we gonna tell them they can't have it at all and it's got to go, or find some way to work with them? Even now under the building codes, you're supposed to get a permit and have everything inspected as you go. But we find things all the time where people didn't do that. And our usual policy has been, rather than saying, well, no, you didn't follow the standard rules, so it's got to go, we used to try to find some way to work with people and at least verify that it's safe. And that's the whole reason for having an engineer, master electrician, master plumber, and a county building inspector look at it. So I'd rather leave it open to some kind of an as-built policy where we could try to handle them when they come up. Now, if we find that there's a manufacturer that's continuing to build tiny homes and sell them in Colorado and not get approved, we would pass it on to the state, say, hey, you got here's a problem manufacturer right here. And it's up to them to take action.
Thanks for explaining that, because I didn't know. Certainly we don't want to penalize somebody who maybe bought one of these unknowingly, that they're not knowing that there were state regulations in place at this point. What about a person who wants to build their own tiny home? Because I'm sure that there's a lot of, then that they don't fall under some of those state regulations, or they still have to follow some?
If they build it on the site they're going to use it in, it's not the state's at all. It's not off-site construction. It would just be up to us to do the inspections every step of the way.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, I think that we need to have some regulations, and I appreciate you talking about what that might look like. Certainly want to make sure that people are safe, but it sounds like what you're proposing is, just that, is to make sure that these buildings are safe for occupancy, that there's a way to get out in case of a fire, that there's not shoddy kind of electrical things happening in them. And kind of curious about, changing the land use code. I think that that's fine to start accepting, the as-built kind of situation. I'm sure that eventually the state regulations will sort of catch up with folks who are not doing this within state standards. And curious about the smaller septic and kind of other ways that we can accommodate, these. But certainly, it seems like there's at least, some people in our community that want to try this. One other question that I had, so I'm supportive, I'm sorry, I'm maybe not being clear, but I am supportive of looking at creating a policy of what you suggested seems to make sense to me. And one question I had about the foundation. So some folks, tiny homes provide this mobility kind of option. So how, are these fairly permanent kind of at this point when we're requiring the foundation? Does it make it pretty permanent? Or is it something that you can, I guess you could pull up rebar or whatever that kind of stuff is, but it would be pretty.
It's supposed to be, yeah, permanent, but even a house built on a normal foundation, sometimes someone buys it and moves it, and they just, but it's hard. It's not easy. It's not like a mobile home where you just roll it off. You'd have to disconnect it from the foundation, put it up on a truck, take it away.
Okay.
So it should be fairly permanent, but
So this isn't meant to necessarily accommodate sort of a transient lifestyle, but more people who want this as a permanent option.
if they want
Okay.
a transient lifestyle, then they
They
would
really-
follow the
30
RV
days.
rules, and they could live, depending on whether it's vacant or not property, 180 days or 30 days. And we have talked to the clerk's office too, because they've been involved in mobile home legislation. They're looking at this year going forward and how you title these things. And if someone got this on a permanent foundation, got a building permit, then it would become permanent, like a modular home attached to the ground, and they would lose their vehicle title. But then 3-4 years later, they might decide they want to pick it up and move it to Florida or something. They'd have to retitle it somehow. So they're already trying to figure those out.
There's some complication in that, but we're not too worried about that. Somebody else's work to do.
Basically, someone's going to have to decide, and what I've been told by some of the tiny home builders is, a lot of their business right now are people who want to live in the thing permanently. So they're not planning to move it every 2 months or 6 months or whatever.
Thank you.
Any other questions, Commissioner Stevens?
Excuse me. No, I'm fine. Thank you.
Commissioner Kaphalis?
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Eric. I fear that there won't be enough time to really discuss this, talk this through, but I'll offer a couple of thoughts or questions, and maybe we need to follow up. One is, I just want to make sure that I understand this state regulatory scheme that you've just described. If manufacturers like Mitchcraft in our community don't pay all those fees to be certified and approved for manufacturing and selling in Colorado, that they can't do that. Is that correct?
They can't manufacture. This whole program is for tiny homes to be used for long term. So if they're building and selling tiny homes to be used as RVs, that doesn't fall under this program at all. Or if they're selling tiny homes for out of state, and they told us a lot of the homes they're building are going to Maine or Kansas or somewhere else. There's a specific exception in the state rules that manufacturers don't have to comply if these are for units to go to a different state.
Yeah, but the goal is to, I thought when we entered into this policy discussion and passed legislation, the goal was to incentivize tiny homes as as part of our comprehensive plan, diversity of housing options. And it seems like the opposite has happened with this, what appears to me to be quite a dramatic overreach as far as regulations and costs. So I'm trying to, I understand about consumer safety and all of that, but this seems to be a disincentive for doing what we're hoping to achieve. Would you care to comment on that?
I tend to agree. I think maybe tiny homes are a new product, and they don't quite fit in the existing boxes, and I think maybe the technical advisory committee looked at the more like manufactured or modular homes and large factories that are cranking out all these. So it's a pretty comprehensive set of rules. I mean, and yeah, it can be onerous for some of the small manufacturers.
Well, just a couple of other things, and I guess we'll see where this takes us. So I'm understanding also that tiny homes on wheels, in order to be considered a more permanent residence, they have to be put on either a permanent or a temporary foundation. And I think, Eric, you tried to explain that that is the case, but the whole idea of some level of mobility, I mean, could you help with that? Because I thought you could, as long as you can get the plumbing right and the electricity right, you could keep your tiny homes on wheels and still stay at that location, past 6 months or whatever.
To not, well, I mean, they can, I don't have a problem with keeping the wheels and the chassis, the trailer there, but you'd have to attach that to a permanent foundation somehow.
Would have to attach that?
To get a building permit for long-term occupancy. So basically, tiny home owners are going to have to decide whether they want it to be temporary or permanent. If they want a permanent installation and get a building permit, they have to go through either the state program or our program. If they want to be able to pick it up and move it, then they don't need a building permit for that, couldn't get a building permit for it, would have to comply with our land use code rules on RVs. But those land use code rules are something, subject to change. I mean, just thinking out loud, if it was an approved tiny house, maybe they could keep it on the property longer than 30 days or something.
So if I may, just one more question, then an attempt to provide some direction here. My question is, I just learned that you can actually buy a tiny home through entities like Home Depot. I'm just looking online. I saw a couple of tiny homes for sale, one for $43,000. So how would these, whatever we do at the county level and, what's being proposed at the state level, how would that apply to this type of sale?
Well, if Home Depot or other large manufacturers are selling things that they're saying are tiny homes that can be lived in, then I think they'd have to register with the state as a seller, dealer, or perhaps a manufacturer, depending on whether they're making them themselves or they're buying them from a third party. Yeah, we already have that problem, as you can go online and buy a tiny house, but no one's looked at it. There's no state certification on it. I don't think any local government's looked at it. So that's kind of a buyer beware thing. I know Tough Shed also sells sheds that are pretty small that sometimes turn into cabins. And I don't know if that's, with a wink wink, or they sell a shed and then the owner decides, hey, I could live in this thing. It's built pretty well. So that would be problematic, the Home Depot of tiny homes.
Thank you, and if I may, just my two thoughts on direction, and hopefully we'll have more opportunity. One is I think the idea of if we have 100 tiny homes in Lambert County, I really would want to make sure that there is a way to ensure that they stay as where people are living. So as-built permit, I think that makes sense, whatever that process is. And then also, I think in the presentation that you provided us, there was something about maybe greater flexibility in what we do at the local level. I just want us to do, whether it's land use code or whatever we need to do, create an atmosphere where we're incentivizing this type of housing. So if that means flexibility while still protecting, safety and consumer safety and people not getting, buying product that is not, top-notch product, I mean, that's what I'd like us to do. Because otherwise, I think the whole point of this is we're going in the opposite direction with all of these fees and regulations. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree totally. I not that my opinion matters here, it matters what you three think, but I think we're looking to make sure the consumer is protected, the home is safe, but there's flexibility for this housing option.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Eric. I just want to do a time check before I go into my questions and comments. So what are we at, Leslie? How much more time do you need?
I think if we reserve 10 or 15 minutes at the end, we'll be fine.
Okay.
And for what it's worth, I have to leave at 2:25.
Okay. So, I'd like to go back to, why I asked this question, because I had folks who lived in tiny homes and RV parks but couldn't move, needed to leave, but had nowhere to go, because I found out after I said, well, can we put this in the land use code to make these somewhere they can place their tiny home, and find out we can't do that because technically we're not legal as tiny homes in the state of Colorado. So this land use code this change in policy was meant to make sure they were legal in the state of Colorado, and that we had some regulations for safety. And yes, I agree, there's probably some costs there for smaller folks, but also we know we have folks the Tiny Home Festival had over 30,000 people attend it. It's a profitable industry, and there's a lot of folks, and there's a wide range of folks. But the whole idea is that we had some housing variability and some different options for folks. And I know that, a lot of these conversations came up during our stakeholdering, which were pretty robust conversations. And I know I'm glad we're addressing the previous built and making sure those come up to snuff. I have toured a few of those that were put up to sale as houses out in the mountains. And when I went to go look and realized we're walking in on a tiny home, that real estate agent said, oh yeah, we realize these are completely out of compliance. So once you buy it, you're going to have to bring everything into compliance. And you're walking through going, this is not safe. And you wonder, like, okay, should we get out of the building while you're walking through? And it's like, how is this ever even able to be sold, right? So I know there's a lot of those out there that are a little bit suspect, that you wonder, how they got there. And I know we have to kind of address some of those that are out there. I see them all the time. And so I think this is a good conversation. So I know that conversation was kind of kick the can down the road, or whatever you want to say, to like, well, what are we going to do? Let's get this in place so that we have something, and address lots of them that are in the state that have been put up without really a legal option before this law passed. So I don't know, I wasn't a part of the technical advisory committee that wrote all those rules. I was hoping they would carve out something a little different for tiny homes, but I can understand they didn't really want to recreate the wheel. My question, so I'm very curious about this. Eric, I might give you a call and find out how this maybe can be advocated for. So I do agree that we need to address what we need to do for our county, because I think we have kind of what I call the Larimer way. We find solutions for our county and try to address what's best for our residents and try to make sure they're also safe. But there is also the wildfire safety and the community safety. So I have a couple of questions, and I saw that on the one of those regulations was non-combustible, and I think it was only a certain height, or was it 5 feet? I was trying to remember what it was. Maybe you remember the non-combustible. Is it only on the bottom, or is it the whole?
Well, our county rules, since there aren't any state rules yet, is that siding has to be at least Class C siding, which is almost any siding meets that. And either the lowest 4 feet be non-combustible, or the first 5 feet out be non-combustible ground cover.
Okay.
So the embers won't land in combustible material next to the house.
Yeah.
Now, these will come out, they'll already be built, they'll probably meet the Class C siding, almost everything but wood shakes or some plastics do. But we're also proposing that they have to put it on, just clear the ground cover around for 5 feet.
Yeah.
Make it that's easily done.
So, yeah, that's what I thought. And I guess I'm thinking about this more after Marshall Fire, now looking at the Hawaii devastation, which is just heart-wrenching. I'm sure a lot of those homes were not ever considering a wildfire coming through that area. But we're going to have, those were winds and driven, but it's still something to kind of consider. It's not if, but when, and a lot of these natural disasters in our area. So that permanent foundation, knowing that some of these might be built on hillsides or have runoff, or I can just imagine, I saw the cinder blocks, and if it's the ground underneath, if we don't go in the ground, this is speaking for someone who has 30 caissons in her home, thinking about washing out underneath or moving the ground under some of those points, or just the cinder blocks. Is that a consideration if one side, like the hillside or something, gets washed out underneath and it's on the ground? I'm just picturing, is that a concern with flooding, or with certain areas, if it's near a burn area, and it's like a big washout and washes away the dirt around and under. Would that be something to be considered with with these foundations that are not like drilled into the ground?
Right. Well, I mean, I think it's a consideration for any house if there's erosion and then it, can undo the foundation. But typically, you either put the footing and foundation 30 inches in the ground, or sometimes I'm imagining tiny homes built sort of like some cabins are, where there's actually piers every 8 feet or something like that, comes up out of the ground, and then you've got the joist and it's sitting on those. And as long as it's attached to the pier and the pier's in the ground, then
Okay.
that should work as well. There's the whole question of whether you need a frost depth foundation, not to get too technical, but if you build a house on the ground, you're losing some heat into the ground. Any moisture in the ground freezes and thaws, can cause heaving. But a tiny home is built more like a modular home, which is it comes out already insulated underneath and wrapped. There really shouldn't be that much heat going into the ground, and that was one of the things the Board of Appeals discussed when we brought it to them, is like, do we really need a frost depth foundation for a tiny home? They weren't really convinced we needed that. They also wanted to make sure things were safe, especially tiny homes going up in the mountains, and make sure they're designed to the high wind and heavy snow loads. But given that, they were also in favor of some, degree of flexibility for these things.
Okay. Well, I think there's probably more to discuss here, but I do kind of support your recommendation, kind of having some kind of a policy or dealing with previously built some in the areas, because I do know there's some that are in our county that are, I think code compliance has a lot of concerns about, so it gives it a chance for us to work with them trying to address some of these safety issues in code compliance. And I also think wildfire issues and having all compliance with the wildfire hazard mitigation area is a really important point for me, because I think if all the other homeowners are having to make sure they have a safety zone, we should have a safety ignition zone, I think that's called, or hazard ignition-free zone. I think it'd be important to have those same homeowners kind of, having those safe wildfire hazard mitigation areas. So I pretty appreciate, I know you and I, there's been a lot of time and a lot of work with this, and when I read through all that, I was like, wow, that's a lot for these homes. But I appreciate the conversation today. I do think, I think flexibility, but I think the kind of remembering why we started this for safety and flexibility and having these, but also making sure we get everyone kind of on the same level with compliance, it would be important. So I hope that helps. Did you have any other, is that clear from all of us? Or?
No, I think that is helpful. I hear general support for this. There's questions about wildfire and erosion and footings and how we mesh with the state law, but that we want to keep these affordable and have some flexibility, and that's kind of where I was going too, so.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Appreciate it. This is very interesting for me.
Thank you.
I guess because I've seen so many, so thank you.
Hopefully soon we can tell your friends in the or your constituents in that RV park that they can apply for a permit to put it on their property.
Thank you. Commissioner Stevens.
Yeah, and maybe somebody else can answer besides Eric too. Is like, so if we need tweaks to the land use code to make some of this happen, right, the as-built kind of permitting, how long are we looking at for that kind of process?
Matt, didn't we put a place car holder for tiny homes in the comprehensive plan? So it's already got a placeholder and we just had to fill it in?
Yeah, there's a spot in there that talks about tiny homes as being something that we were going to come through in the future. From the land use code perspective, my biggest concern is we need to understand what Eric was just talking about. What is a tiny home not on wheels? What is a tiny home on wheels that we can live in? What are RVs and not we've got to come up with what our understanding of each one of those things are. And then once we've understood that, then we can determine in the land use code the appropriateness of that from a land use perspective. Where can it be, on what property, by what standards and things like that? Or do we need to do a manufactured housing park type scenario for tiny homes or stuff like that if we're going to have these more mobile or nomadic type of arrangements and stuff. So I'm excited to see where we land when Eric's done with all his stuff in the building codes, so that we can then start looking at the different types of tiny homes or not tiny homes and get them properly classified in land use code, and then put the proper regulations into place. And that'll take, a few months. It doesn't have to take a long time.
And I think in general, the approach that we've been discussing is, and Eric mentioned this, is treating, once we've defined what is a tiny home and what's allowed under the building code, treating it like any other dwelling. So it could be a primary dwelling on a property, it could be an accessory living area on a property, it could be a farmstead property. So any other situation where we allow either a manufactured home or a stick-built home, a tiny home could be that dwelling type too. But we've got some just kind of technical details to work out of exactly how those things get defined.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Matt.
All right. Good afternoon. I'm Rebecca Everett, Community Development Director. Just have a few updates for you all, mostly related to upcoming hearings and other meetings. So as you know, you have 2 land use hearings scheduled today, one at 3 o'clock, one at 6:30. Our 3 o'clock hearing has 5 items on consent and 1 on discussion. The item on discussion is a 1041 permit application for a solar facility. And we do anticipate we may have members of the public attend for items that are on the consent agenda, so we will work with them to understand if any of them have an interest in pulling items off of the consent agenda, and make sure if we, as staff, know that there's a request for that we can pull those as staff or communicate that to you all, and provide people with the instructions on how to
And
how to do
potentially
that.
commissioners may want to pull one of those items off the consent agenda as well. So,
Absolutely, that's
okay.
always an option. And then the evening hearing tonight at 6:30, we have just one item. It's a special event permit application that was referred up to you by me as the director for additional public input and a decision by the Board of County Commissioners. A couple other updates, the evening hearing for August 28th, so we're at August 14th right now, so our next hearing date is August 28th. We will have a 3 p.m. hearing that day. We will not have a 6:30 p.m. hearing that day, so you should see a cancellation on that appointment. So no evening hearing on the 28th. And then finally, the September joint work session between the BCC and Planning Commission. We're going to shift that one to Planning Commission only because we have 2 of our county commissioners absent. I believe Commissioner Stevens and Commissioner Shattuck McNally will both be absent that day from what we understand.
Remind me which day again?
That is, September 13th.
Yes.
I actually will be around.
Okay.
I'm not going to attend the 10 county budget retreat.
All right, well, we can evaluate then what the topics are for that meeting and determine whether we can continue to have that as a joint meeting or a planning commission only work session.
Well, if needed, I can always attend remotely. So.
Okay. Okay, great.
But it's just, I plan to go to that, so.
Okay. Well, we'll take a look at what we've got on the agenda for that and check back in on that. That's helpful to understand if attendance plans for that one. That's it for my updates.
Okay, so Leslie, do you
All
have?
right. Yes, and I will go on. I just have a couple, 2. One is the fair and rodeo wrapped up on Wednesday, as you know, and I think we had another very successful year. We've seen increases in attendance year over year of about 25,000 people, and Connor and his team are compiling all the information, and we'll come back to you with a work session to report out some of the happenings at that and some of the successful events. I'd like to just extend a thank you to you all for participating and attending, and certainly to Connor McGrath and his staff, Louise Romero and Mark Ticklenberg, the OVG staff, the board and commission members. I mean, there are so many people involved in an event like that and pulling it all together, and certainly hundreds of volunteers. Our sheriff's office worked very closely with the ranch and the vendors and the carnival, and so many who were involved. So it was really great to see the community out and participating. And then just a reminder too, we have the water education series that's coming up, and the first one starts next Monday evening at 6 o'clock here at the county building. And that is a series of 4 water related events that are happening starting in August and going through November that you all have worked with CSU to sponsor. And so we're looking forward to seeing those start to happen. And there's information if people are interested on the Water Center Colorado State EDU webpage that that itemizes the different events and their dates and the topics. And so if anybody's interested in that, that first one is happening on Monday. And those are really my 2 updates for today.
Commissioner Kafas has his hand raised.
Yes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, colleagues. How are we marketing the, besides the CSU website, but how are we marketing the water education series?
I know Michelle Bird has been working very closely with the folks at CSU on the specifics of that. And so I may have to follow up with more information about that.
Because I would think typically our public affairs folks will do social media posts and other things.
Yeah, I'm looking to see if, I know Lorenda's been out too, so you may not have the details on that, but we can certainly follow up on that.
I don't, and I'm looking at the website. I can't tell from the website how it's been published. We'll find out the details.
Yeah, I think that would be important, and the sooner we can all be on the same page to get the word out, because I think it's important what we're doing.
Yeah.
And the general public should know, not just the folks who are really into the water thing, which is everyone, actually.
Yes. We will follow up on that.
Mr. Stevens, did you have any questions or comments?
Well, at one point, we had talked about each of the commissioners kind of taking one of the nights and doing kind of the intro piece or something like that, and I don't remember if that was ever divvied out, or that was, so maybe we can kind of look into that and see.
Okay.
I believe mine was November.
See who was going to be doing that, so.
Okay.
Yeah, remind me, I thought I was doing November, but I could be wrong, so.
We will follow up on that.
Okay.
So, yeah. All right.
Thank you.
And I have no further updates for this afternoon. Thank you.
Okay, and I know Commissioner Kafas needed to leave early, so any other conversations or anything? Okay. Well, with that then, at 2:23, we are adjourned. Thank you all for all the presentations and information.